Hi there, this is Dylan from Teach English Spain, and this is a video entitled A Short Guide to Using the Board. And this video is basically about using the board in English language classes. Now, of course, there are three typical types of boards: the original, the traditional blackboard and chalk, plastic whiteboards with markers, and now we have interactive whiteboards or smart boards, digital boards. Now, I'm really going to be talking about whiteboards and markers here. And also, many of the things I say are also applicable to you if you're using blackboards and chalk or interactive whiteboards. But I think the most common type of board now is the plastic whiteboard and the marker. Okay, so just remember that the board is really useful, perhaps the most useful piece of equipment. And I have to be honest here, many teachers don't use the board as effectively as they could, and I include myself here. And as an experienced teacher, I've got lots of bad habits, so I have to remind myself to improve my board work every day. So the first question is about colors. What colors should you use? Well, if your board is white, then you need colors which contrast. So I would definitely suggest black and blue for almost everything you write on the board in terms of text, in terms of letters and words. You might want to, for example, use black for the sentences. And if you're focusing on a particular piece of vocabulary or a collocation or a verb, then you could write that key piece of language in blue. And also other colors can be used for highlighting, underlining, marking errors, circling, etc. So just try to be as creative as possible, but stick to black and blue for most of the text, most of the words and the sentences that you write on the board, and you won't go far wrong. Use the other colors for noticing certain aspects. How big should your writing be? Well, there's a very simple way to test it. Write a few sentences on the board, then go to the back of the room and see which one you feel comfortable with. So it's kind of like an optician's chart. You go to the back of the room and you think, okay, well, that seems about right. The other thing, of course, is ask your students. Ask your students at the beginning, when you first start teaching them, what size writing they feel comfortable with. And what, if they have any problems reading your board work, then obviously you have to make the writing slightly larger. Try to avoid writing words in a really big way on the board, because you're not making great use of the board if you do that. Should you write in print or write in cursive? Now, cursive is joined up writing, whereas print is basically what we read on a computer screen. The letters are separated. So this really depends on where you're teaching. In some contexts, students feel very comfortable writing in cursive script. However, if you're teaching a multilingual class, it makes sense to write in print, because most students will be able to read that and understand it quite clearly. And I would suggest that even if your students are comfortable with writing in cursive, it might be a good idea to actually write in print, just because that's how most people read now online. And increasingly, that's where we're getting most of our information from, online sources. So I would say, if you're not great at writing in print, just practice, and over time you'll get much better at doing so. Capital letters, when should you use them? Well, try to be as accurate as possible and try to be consistent. So think of, again, how you would normally write something, if it's correct to do so or if it's conventional to do so. You might want to use all capitals if you've got a big heading that you want to use on the board. For example, if I'm writing about or trying to generate lots of items of vocabulary related to the topic of food, I might draw a circle in the middle, write food in capitals in the middle with lines coming from it. Again, it might make sense actually just to capitalize the first letter of food, F, just to show it's a heading. But I don't think there's anything too wrong with using capitals for headings. But just remember that your students often write down what you write in their notebooks. and they'll refer back to them later. So you don't want to confuse them. Can the learners write on the board? This for me is an obvious question, and the answer is a definite yes. It's their board too. Try to make the classes as interactive as possible, which means getting students out of their seats, which is a very passive position. Get them writing on the board, get them using the board, drawing on the board, writing sentences, writing words on the board. Get them doing as much as possible, as long as it doesn't take too much time. Couple of things I do on the board: student dictations. I stand at the back, I dictate either a word or a sentence or a phrase. Students go to the board and write down what they hear. Very simple exercise, and you can get, for example, 4 students writing at the same time. You could divide the board into sections, they each write in their section, and then they can actually give feedback on what the other students have written on the board at the same time. If you only get one student writing on the board to do a dictation, that can take a long time. So I would suggest getting them to write at the same time. Using the board for correcting student errors. When I did my training, I think one of my trainers told me not to do that because the students would write down the error in their notebook. Now, as long as you tell them it's an error, then they won't write it down. So I would suggest do it as much as you can. Again, if a student makes a mistake in their writing, perhaps you could write it on the board or get the student to write the mistake on the board. See if they can correct it for themselves. If that particular student can't, encourage peer correction. If the peers can't help, then you as the teacher could correct. Just remember to be sensitive. You don't want to expose students to mistakes. You don't want to put the students in an uncomfortable position of seeing their mistakes too often on the board. So I would suggest, if, for example, you do a writing exercise and you notice 4 or 5 mistakes, write them on the board and don't basically point out which mistake came from which student. So keep it nice and open, and the students can learn from each other's mistakes. Recording new vocabulary. Again, the board is fantastic for doing that. So you can use spidergrams, where you draw a circle in the middle with lines coming out, and you can add the words to the end of each line. It's kind of a mind map, a very simple mind map. When you have new vocabulary, just remember to identify the stress patterns, how many syllables the word has, and which syllable is stressed. So, for example, if you have the word intelligent, you can divide that into 4 syllables. Intelligent. Which syllable is stressed? Intelligent. So you can make a mark above tell, a circle or a box or a line, to indicate that's the syllable that's stressed. So students can record that in their notebook, and then they'll know how to pronounce it correctly next time. If you use phonemic symbols, write those on the board as well. And intonation, you can draw arrows going up, down, or wavy, however you want, to indicate intonation patterns, certainly with short phrases or sentences. Margins are great. I generally draw a margin or a couple of margins on the board. And when I get unexpected vocabulary, like a student may say, "What does this word mean?" or "How do you say this in English?" I can write that on the board in one of the margins. So it's kind of incidental. It's not necessarily the main topic of the class, but I can use that list of words at the end for a quick review activity. Grammar presentations can be done really well on the board. I would suggest, again, if you have your margins, do the grammar presentation in the center of the board so the students are all focused. That zone should be kept clear for presenting target language, whether vocabulary, grammar, or even pronunciation, or, for example, structures. I suggest creating a board plan, especially for grammar presentations, on a piece of paper. Just think about what your board is going to look like at these key points in the lesson, and then you can refer to those plans during the lesson to make sure your board work is as clear as possible. Okay, so it doesn't get too busy and too disorganized when you're doing a new grammar presentation on the board. And remember, with a grammar presentation, It's a good idea to keep the target language on the board for as long as possible, or at least a marker sentence, an example sentence, so students can refer back to that sentence easily when they do any exercises, practice or production exercises with the new grammar structure. So how often should you clean the board or clear the board? You need to think about this carefully. After a grammar presentation, you might want to actually keep the key point, the key structure on the board and just get rid of everything else. Again, train students to know when they should be looking at what you're writing on the board and focusing on that, when they should be noting what they've seen on the board in their notebooks. Make sure they know that they don't have to write everything down. Some students write everything that you put on the board in their notebooks, and then their own notes become really disorganized, and they're not able to prioritize the important stuff from the less important stuff. But target language, yeah, you've got to have a clear structure. Okay, I'm writing this now, focus, use it, and then maybe give students time to note down the key structures or the key pieces of the language in their notebooks. So obviously don't clear the board too quickly after a grammar presentation or a vocabulary presentation. And just remember that with an old style board or even the modern white boards, space is limited. Okay. So you don't want to write too much on the board, even though some students seem to love that. They seem to think they've done a really good class or had a really good class if they've written loads of stuff from your whiteboard in their notebooks. But how much of that are they going to retain? So you've got to be clear about your aims, and those aims should, to a large extent, define or dictate how much you write on the board and how you present on the board. Of course, between activities, think about good times to actually clear the board. If, for example, you give the students an activity, monitor them, make sure they're doing the activity correctly, and then maybe you can just take a break from monitoring them, go to the board, clear it, and perhaps prepare it for the next activity, which might be feedback or the next stage of the lesson. Using the board for games, I do lots of games on the board, simple things like bingo, word games based around noughts and crosses, sentence jumbles, word jumbles, lots of things. So I would suggest to use the board as often as you can for games. And often you can do activities on the board where the students have to run to the board and write things. In another blog post or another video, I will hopefully give you some ideas about using the board for games. There are so many, so I don't really have time to go through them now. And if you make a mistake on the board, well, don't panic. Don't panic. It's very common, especially with the inexperienced teachers, to write words incorrectly on the board. You wouldn't write that word, you wouldn't misspell that word when you write it on a piece of paper. But for some reason, when you see it on the board, it often doesn't look right. So there are a couple of things to do if you make a mistake. Admit it. Just be honest. You're not perfect. Your students will appreciate your honesty as long as you don't do it too often. You can congratulate the students on spotting the deliberate mistake. And again, often I write things on the board and ask students to check in their dictionaries, whether it's an online dictionary or an app or a paper dictionary. But then that gives them some learner autonomy. They're taking a bit more control of the learning. Now, you will probably be asked to draw or required to draw things on the board. And many of us think we can't draw, but actually most of us can. So stick figures are fine. In fact, there's quite a lot of research to show that actually stick figures are often more effective than more complex pictures, because students have to maybe work a bit harder to identify the picture, and it becomes almost something that's really quite fundamental to them. And actually, like kids, people are very good at recognizing stick figures. You'd be surprised. So there are a couple of books you can actually buy, or you can get some training on how to create very simple stick figures, just with lines and shapes. So you don't have to be an expert. And also, again, if you're not great at drawing and you know students are and they like to draw on the board, get them to draw things. Why not? Is there anything you shouldn't write on the board? Well, don't write too much on the board. It's not a dumping ground. And some teachers or trainee teachers I see, they write everything on the board. So let's say they're teaching an intermediate class and they elicit the word dog and they write the word dog on the board. Now, if you're an intermediate learner, you should be able to write the word dog. You should know the spelling. So it's kind of pointless to write it on the board. And so if it's language they already know, I would suggest you can do a couple of things. Test them, ask them, okay, how do you spell this word? Get them to provide the correct answer. Perhaps even nominate a student to go on the board and write it. Or you say to them, how do you spell the word dog? And they give you the spelling and you write it on the board. Is that correct? Yep, that's correct. Great. And then it's just basically confirmation of something the students already know, so you can clear it very quickly. Okay, but don't write too much on the board. Your board work will become very disorganized if you do so, and then the students won't really be able to necessarily focus that much on the key aspects of the lesson. So I hope that was useful. Getting better at writing on the board takes time and practice, but if you get feedback from other teachers and of course your students, then you'll get a lot better. And feel free to ask the students what they like. In fact, you might actually notice that getting students to write on the board helps you because you see, that's a good way of doing so, and actually using ideas from your students. Again, your students may have very good note-taking skills, which you can actually use for when you write things on the board. And of course, if you have the opportunity, watch other teachers, get feedback from other teachers, share ideas, and ask for advice. That really helps. So this was a video from Teach English Spain. If you want to check out the website, it's at www.teachenglishspain.com. And if you'd like to send me a message, please do so at info@teachenglishspain.com. Okay, so thanks for watching. Bye for now.